Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PRCA and the Work Crowds event on what makes great PR. I'm delighted to be chairing and hosting this event. My name is Alice Weightman. I am the chair of the Independence Group and also the founder of the Work Crowd. The Work Crowd is an online platform and we connect fantastic talent across marketing and communications globally to projects. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Zaiba and Gaby. We're also supposed to be having Joan, but she's unfortunately just messaged saying she's running late, so she will be joining, but held up in a meeting. The joys of Zoom meetings and webinars at the moment. So, but it's been great to discuss this topic on what makes great PR, because there's lots of sort of sometimes magical ingredients people think to get those awesome PR campaigns, but also critically, things that we should probably avoid. So for the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to have a discussion on this topic, ask our panel a series of questions, and then we do want to open up to the audience. We've got an excellent turnout today of over 100 sign-ups to the event, made up of both freelancers as well as business owners. So please do use the functionality at the bottom where you'll see Q&A and also the chat function, and I'll try and feed that into Gaby and Zaiba. So let's kick off. And before we actually get into what makes great PR, what does great PR mean? Zaiba, can I ask you first, what's your opinion on what is great PR?
Sure. Hi, Alice. Hello, Gaby. And a very warm welcome to everyone who's watching today. Thank you for joining us. I suppose, given the work that I do, so I work essentially in reputation in crisis. I may kind of have two views of what good PR is. So the first kind of element of that is genuinely proactive, positive PR. So it's really where a company, a client, an organization has complete control over what it does and why it's doing it. So there it's maybe essentially to engage, to energize, to bring people together in terms of PR. Now, because of my role and having 20 years of experience as a journalist, there's, I think, also another element of PR, which is really kind of reactive PR. So it's dealing with something that you have to get out and talk about when you've faced a more negative issue. So we see companies that do this on both sides, and that maybe is really more about informing an audience, really. But I still think it's still part about engaging, about energizing it, and bringing people together as well. And maybe just one example, I think, is maybe just to bring it to life a bit. Say, take a company like McDonald's, which we know and is obviously known around the world. So McDonald's is very good and very creative in its campaigning. So we see, for example, over lockdown, it gave away free jigsaw puzzles. Its recent ad campaign is an ad campaign which is just full of laughter. It's just, there's no dialogue in there. It's just front to end kind of laughter, hearing people giggling in McDonald's. But on the other side, I would say there's a significant amount of PR that McDonald's has to handle, which is about being reactive. So it's around issues where they've been criticized for how they deal with employees, the kind of training opportunities around health, around food, obviously in the supply chain as well. Where do they source their food? So often they will kind of do campaigns, I think, that are much more informative. I've got a 9-year-old son, so the kind of the food quality and the sourcing for me is important. So I think, yeah, there are kind of two sides. I think there is kind of the lovely kind of part of PR where you have control, where you're not reacting to something, where it does feel like you have more control over what you can do it and the tone that you can use it. But I think we also need to mix that with PR, like I say, which can also be, and increasingly, I think in this day and age, a much more empathetic and kind of has some sense of how we are as humans, basically.
Great, thank you, Zaiba. And it'd be nice to sort of deep dive into more of that. Gaby, I mean, obviously your background, you've been a PR consultant for a number of years and worked for some interesting brands like Nike, Coca-Cola, Sweaty Betty. What's your opinion on what makes great PR?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great question because, hello, everybody in the audience. I'm sure you all have a different perspective on what PR for your business or for you personally might mean. And I think that it is a huge spectrum because on the one end, I was doing a lot of consumer PR sort of 20 or so years ago for the likes of Nike and Coke. And that was all about just getting a great positive story in the press. It was mainly print media then, about a new product or a new service. So that's a simple definition of good PR, which is positive endorsement from your defined influencers. But on the other end of what I do more now, which is supporting startups and lean scale ups, it's actually more about sales and the impact that PR can have in a much more simplistic term on the bottom line. You know, a startup will only survive based on the cash flow that it has. And obviously part of that is sales. And there are amazing ways now that PR and SEO, which is search engine optimization, can work together as sort of bedfellow tools to drive coverage from, let's say, an online magazine with a link that goes through to that business's website. And that is called a backlink. And that can then be converted into a sale. There are other tools and devices on the website that will help push that through the funnel. So for startups, that is what great PR is. And as I said, on the other end of the spectrum, there's big consumer brands. And then also in there are B2B businesses as well. So businesses that are selling to other businesses, often that great PR is again, probably online endorsement for a new product or an innovation, or indeed some interviews or expert comments from the leadership team within that business. So yes, lots and lots of definitions for different people of what great PR means.
Great, thank you. And interesting, you mentioned the backlinks. We had something pop up just as you were saying it on surely it's about backlinks. So
for some it is, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Zaiba, your background, obviously journalist originally and now director of Coppergate Communications, and you've worked across again a number of different clients. You know, from Shell to Pret A Manger, TSB. What makes a great story? And actually, someone's already asked what makes a great strategy. And it'd be good to sort of, with the understanding of a journalist, like how do you engage with journalists from a good story point of view?
Okay, so I think the critical thing is to understand, you know, what it is that you want to achieve. I think between myself and Gaby, you know, I think that there are a number of objectives that you may have. Is it to increase sales? Is it to improve your reputation? You know, is it to increase awareness? You know, of course, there are also public health campaigns, aren't there? Which have become obviously very, very important over COVID as well. So I think the critical thing is for you to understand, you know, internally, what's the critical objective? Okay, what is it that we want to achieve through this campaign? So I think that's the real kind of starting point. And then in terms of dealing with journalists, you know, of course, you know, journalists are just one kind of platform amongst kind of audiences. I mean, obviously, you know, you can engage directly with your audiences through social media as well. So recognizing that the journalist is a conduit for engaging with another audience, possibly when you can't, you know, engage with them directly. So I think it's also helpful to understand to be absolutely honest, what do you get from engaging with a journalist that you might not be able to do through your own social media, through your own platforms, basically? What's the need? Because, you know, it's not the easiest thing. I think anyone who's dealt with media relations, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people watching in now, you know, it's a very tricky thing, isn't it? It can be very time consuming. And quite frankly, it can also be very demoralizing as well. Journalists are not always the friendliest people, I would say. So I think that it's to understand why are you, you know, why does this particular campaign or PR strategy require a media kind of relations campaign? And from there, I think, again, understanding your objective. To be honest, it's just about being very, very tailored. It's not throwing out, you know, a big blanket out there and seeing what comes back. I'm a big believer in very tailored campaigns when you talk to journalists, because I would say, and I think a lot of journalists would agree with me, that, you know, journalists really enjoy working with PR companies, but actually, I think the biggest kind of gripe that they have is that actually, do people in PR always understand their particular format, their particular style of writing, what they do? You know, even between the tabloids, which I think is where obviously a lot of consumer stories can sit in terms of PR campaigns. You know, there's a difference between the Sun and the Mail and the Mirror. Hello, Joan's just joined us. You know, there's a big difference between the tabloids as well. So even that, I think it's just really understanding, you know, the tone of a particular journalist and their outlet, basically. And even within a particular outlet, you know, journalists have very different styles as well. Just because you're talking to the Sun doesn't necessarily mean all journalists will, you know, kind of regard your story as either a dud or a good one, basically. So I would say absolutely get to know your journalists and what they write about, as well as what their output is, basically. And then really understand, you know, how do you want to have something that's kind of unique to one particular outlet, or do you want a broader coverage as well? But even then, it's tailoring that narrative. So it's not, you know, one size fits all. I think journalists will really appreciate you developing a story and taking different elements of that story and, you know, kind of matching it with a particular journalist as well.
Zaiba, thank you for that. And Joan, welcome. I know you've been held up, so thank you very much indeed for still battling away and getting on.
What makes good PR is not being late, Alice. So apologies to you and to everybody.
No, we're delighted you made it. So doesn't matter, better late than never. Joan, just for the audience, is head of brand and corporate communications for Subway and EMEA, and prior to that was actually director of PR for Coca-Cola across Europe. Joan, as you've just joined, I will fire a question at you. So we talked already about what PR means, and we were talking about sort of what makes a good story. But actually, Joan, how does PR get done? It'd be great to sort of hear your thoughts on, and also what you think great PR is. But how do you go about getting it done?
Rather chaotically, I think sometimes. No, I think the getting PR done. I mean, I think there are so many things behind the scenes. I think, you know, you have to prep well. You have to have your story straight. You have to have, I guess, a protect and prepare perspective, you know, first of all. So there's no point going out there telling a story when suddenly you are vulnerable in an area, or you know, things aren't quite sound with your product announcement or your, you know, story that you're telling. So I think you have to do an awful lot of due diligence and prep before you go out there with your story. So I think that's the first thing. I think in terms of getting the story done is really starting with, you know, what is it you want to say, who needs to hear about it, and how are you best going to reach that audience? So very, very practical, and thinking about, you know, it may not be a story in the media that's going to best tell your story to certain communities. So, for example, coming now from a major mainstream brand where everything was in, you know, pretty much mainstream media, or talking to young people, you know, through social media channels, you know, at Subway, we are a franchise model. So, you know, a lot of my storytelling is going to be really focused on the people that have bought into our stores. And that's a very different way of marketing and a very different way of communicating. So I think it's really honing in on getting the prep right, making sure that you've got a very strong background story, so a negative angle has nowhere to go, and that you're fully prepped with who's speaking or how you're communicating. Know where or what you want to say, and making sure that that is engaging and is going to tell the world something new. And then make sure that you're really focused on who needs to hear this story and how best to reach them. Does that answer your question, Alice?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joan. Thank you for jumping straight in there on arrival. Gaby, we've talked a little bit there about these different mediums of PR and also the diversity of that nature of the audience. How do you how do you manage that when you have such a diverse audience and having consistency of messaging across?
Yeah, absolutely. And almost to kind of follow a thread from what Joan was also just saying there, I think it starts with the story, and the story has to be bedded in honesty and authenticity. And I think the key question to ask before you start to nuance the messaging for your different identified audiences is, what does this mean? What does this mean? What kind of impact is this story having on our customers, the world, whatever that may be? And that often is a really useful way of sort of shaking the tree to ensure that your story is strong enough to take out to whoever those influencers or platforms or journalists might be. And also I would just echo that point that both Zaiba and Joan made, that traditional journalists, or the way PR is sometimes thought of in terms of selling a story to a journalist, it's not really like that completely anymore. Certainly that's part of it, but there are so many other ways to craft a story and get a story published. And certainly in the tech space and the wellness space that I work in, it's useful for media platforms if you actually write a perspective or a comment piece yourself. So you're writing it from the perspective of the founder of the business or the product developer, for example. So the world has completely changed. It's not just this kind of transactional process between writing a story and selling it to a journalist. There are all kinds of ways of collaborating with important influencers and media too. But the question about nuancing for audiences, yes, I think it starts with, is it honest? Is it authentic? What impact does it have on these different audiences? So let's imagine a typical business has 4 stakeholder audiences. You've got your customers, your suppliers, your investors, and perhaps your internal audience too. So the core of the story remains the same. The kernel of the story remains the same for all of them. But the way that you nuance it is by asking that question, what difference does it make for that audience? So for example, for an investor audience, it's, if you're launching a new product, it's about the financial impact on the business, which is usually obviously a good one. And then in terms of customers, it's obviously about this product is coming to market and this is why it's so important for your life and the impact that it has there. So each of those audiences, including internal audiences, because they are sometimes your greatest fans and, you know, storytellers that you can harness, each of those audiences, it's about asking a question about the impact that that story would have. So yeah.
Sorry, I'd just like to kind of just sound a warning here, because certainly what I'm seeing is there's certainly a series of question marks that are rising around the use of influencers as well, you know, in terms of the transparency, in terms of payment, in terms of, for example, you know, are they, you know, communicating with younger audiences? So there's been an issue around gambling and the use of influencers and trying to get to younger audiences. So I think, and you know, it's funny how these things kind of come in patterns. I think that there's certainly an issue around the use of influencers. So anyone out there who's considering around using influencers, I think you need to be very aware of the protocols and the guidelines on this, because actually you could ruin what you think is a well-crafted campaign, because you know, it's actually the influencer and maybe the commercial kind of negotiation that's gone on there that's the highlight from a journalist point of view of that particular campaign or that PR strategy, rather than, you know, the foundation of what you thought it was going to be. So don't allow that to become a story. So I think really considering, you know, ambassadors and influencers are, you know, they're great to use, but I think absolutely consider about how you use them. And again, to Joan's point, due diligence is really, really important. I think you can often see strategies that have just been turned around really, really quickly, and they haven't been well considered. And again, you know, it's better to have no campaign at all, no strategy, than one that actually is going to bring the highlight back to you in a negative way.
Absolutely. And so that leads me very nicely into the next question of what should be avoided. So, misuse of influencers the wrong way, but anything else that you think should be avoided when making great PR?
I think it's about integrity, isn't it? I think integrity is really, really, really key. The idea, so what we're seeing more and more, and actually this applies for all types of organizations, whether they're charities or FTSE 100, what we're seeing is, how does this organization, how does this company fit into society, basically? So I think, you're going to get caught out if you don't have integrity in your strategy. So are you preaching something that you don't practice internally? So, I think absolutely you could define the number of kind of critical issues that we're seeing in society at the moment. And this isn't just UK, this is also worldwide, with Black Lives Matter, so a massive impact, and Me Too, so huge focus around what's now called EDI, which is equality, diversity and inclusion. So it's, how inclusive is a company? We have statistics in terms of pay gap and gender and diversity data that comes out about how well you treat your staff internally. So if you have a strategy or a campaign, again, that is completely at odds with what you're doing internally, that's not going to work. The climate challenge is again something that impacts us all. So if you're going to preach on that, what are your net zero ambitions internally as well? This applies to so many clients. And I think, quite a good example of all of this is Brewdog. Brewdog had a massive reputation issue fairly recently. And that all came about, and actually probably was a brand that many people thought as an independently minded, run, creative, adventurous brand. And suddenly, there's this correspondence from inside the company that says, well, actually, there's a really negative, toxic attitude, So I think if you try and, like I say, preach something that you don't practice, I think you will be found out, whether it's through employees blowing the whistle, if it's through your consumers, if it's through, even through politicians, for example. So just be careful of the tone that you use and really where you focus your strategy as well.
Thank you for that.
Two other points from me. Just one is just simply just doing dumb things. I think you can kind of, see a creative idea that you think, oh my God, that's going to really resonate with our audiences. But, the fact that, a soft drink might solve a societal issue, and that wasn't Coke, by the way, that was a Pepsi ad that went very wrong for it. Or the other side is assuming that your audience are either going to know more than you think they do. And again, we saw this go horribly wrong for Burger King when it was meant with good intention, their ad, which was Women Belong in the Kitchen. And it was around Women and Equality Day, but it was actually trying to get more chefs, more female chefs into the kitchens. But the headline was that. And so people didn't read through all their copy and all of their good intentions. And it really backfired for them. So as I say, that was not anything they were doing coming from a bad place. It was just the way they communicated it. And so I think, doing dumb things, which we've all seen. And then again, it's just assuming your audience know more than they do. And I think that can be bad for sort of PR messaging out there.
Great, thank you for that, Joan. We're getting lots of questions coming through actually from the audience, so I've got a few more, and then we will turn to the question to from the audience. Gaby, we've talked a bit about what to avoid. Who's getting it right? What great campaigns have you seen out there that you think is really on the money?
Oh God, I love this part of the conversation. I mean, I think obviously everyone's going to have a different perspective, and my particular I suppose contribution here is where my passions lie at the moment. So I think that brands that are doing good for the world are really getting it right, and the way that they're showing that. So a brand that is Elon Musk, actually, I think he's doing a great job in talking about, on a very public domain, about, green products, green services. I also would say that somebody I've started working with who I feel really strongly is going to become very, very well known soon is a chap called Dale Vince. So Dale Vince was the founder of Ecotricity. He's a bit of a green industrialist. He's been talking a lot in the media this week because obviously we've got COP26 coming up. So as a brand, I think that Dale Vince is really getting it right because he's holding the government to account. He's representing everything that is green and authentic and credible. He owns the greenest football club in the world called Forest Green Rovers. So for me, because I'm personally passionate about this area, he's certainly somebody that I think is really getting it right at the moment.
Thank you. Zaiba, what about you? Who do you think is getting it right and why?
Well, okay, it's not a particular brand, but I'm always really intrigued by, surprisingly, the burger industry. Actually, I think it comes up with really quite innovative ideas. So I'm talking about the likes of KFC, McDonald's, Burger King, and actually, I think they're good because they make me smile. Because they are bold, they use humor often in a very surprising way, and I think they really take some risks sometimes. So a couple of examples are, of course, when KFC ran out of chicken, and it did, it obviously kind of just transformed the KFC into FCK, and then ran a full page ad in the Sun. The speed at which it did that, but it kind of just balanced with an apology to its customers for running out of chicken, and a thank you to its franchise partners and to its staff as well for kind of for their patience. I thought that the kind of tone was right. Yes, it was very adventurous, and likewise we saw over COVID times that also Burger King took out an ad where it said, go and eat at McDonald's, go and eat at Five Guys, go and eat at our competitors, go and support those people who are really committed to keeping you fed, basically, as well. And again, that was an unexpected turn as well. So I think as an industry that keeps having to come up with creative ideas, and I'm very alert to the kind of issues around food supply, about obesity as well. Putting those to one side, if I may, I think it's just quite adventurous, and I think like any consumer, I think anything that brings a smile to my face is always grateful in this day and age, quite frankly.
Thank you. And Joan, what's your thoughts?
Ooh. So they were very similar actually to the others, but actually I do think, and again, only because this is resonating with me right now at Subway, is tone of voice. And I think that tone of voice, and I see a couple of the questions on the chat are a kind of post-COVID world. And I think in my head, it's those brands that are able to kind of engage in banter, which is in the right way for their brand and their company. So know when to use that tone of voice. So, I think we probably all saw, I loved the Weetabix and the baked beans tweet. That I think that was, I don't know, was it early this year or last year, but it was so funny. And it invited almost everybody else in the world, every other brand in the world to comment. And, everybody followed in with their tone of voice. I think Aldi do it really well. There was the Colin the Caterpillar piece, but their response to KFC when they ran out of chicken, it was something like, well, come over to us because we've got loads. There was a really nice banter. And I think, I do think in a post-COVID world, what we're looking for is, it's made us all a leveler. We're all working from home. It requires, we do need to be entertained a bit and not take life too seriously. But then on the flip side, it means that we have to, whatever brands do, we have to do things right. We have to do things really responsibly. So I think there is a real fine balance between entertaining, but doing things with a purposeful view and doing what's right for consumers and communities. So sorry, I maybe went off piece there, but I was slightly owing to the COVID questions on
absolutely.
On the Q&A.
Yeah, we've got quite a few COVID questions that have come through. Has PR changed during COVID, and what's the impact COVID's had long term on the industry? Gaby, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it definitely has. I think obviously a change in the media industry was on its way anyway, and I think perhaps pandemic accelerated this somewhat. So, you know, media platforms have completely changed, and what is a target media platform for a big brand could be very, very different for, you know, a startup. I think that there is more, I'm always a glass half full here, but I think there is more collaboration between brand and business storytellers, i.e. that could be the PR or marketing person in a small business, and the media. And I think that the opportunity, as I said before, to kind of co-curate content and tell a story that isn't about relying on the journalist to tell the story on your behalf, you're actually writing it for them, I think is definitely a change. And I think media are more open to this collaboration, obviously provided that it is based on you know, honesty and credibility. So yeah, that's certainly one change. As I said, I work with a lot of startups, and that's certainly a change that I'm seeing in the way media work. One final thing, because I've seen a story about a question also about backlinks, is that backlinks are getting harder to deliver. So I think that's just one thing to be mindful of, that although, you know, that's the model for driving PR, the power of PR into driving customer conversion, they're much harder because media recognize that's where the value sits. So more and more a value is being put to backlinks, and so that merging of paid and earned is getting a little bit foggy at the moment.
Great, thank you for that. We've had another question around how and which data to use to help inform PR plans. I think it'd be good to sort of talk a bit about measurement and return on investment there. But in terms of data to inform plans, Zaiba, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's really, really tough. I mean, my experience, worked in a couple of global PR agencies, is actually, I find measurement tools just really difficult to kind of gauge which is the right measurement tools, and obviously they're very, very expensive. We've kind of got traditional tools like, you know, kind of coverage in media, what is the tone, you know, what are the kind of keywords that have come up in there as well. I mean, I think measurement is really, really, really hard, but I think it's also just about managing people's expectations. And if you're looking for, you know, kind of a kind of an increase in sales, for example, can you therefore kind of directly relate, you know, a particular strategy to an increase in sales? I mean, how do you do that as well? So to be honest, I think I don't have a kind of a specific answer. I think it is really, really complicated. My advice would be, before you invest in any particular tool, I really think it's worth taking the time to just really investigate, is it the right tool for your company, basically, because you know, it's a cost that you don't want to engage in unless you're absolutely sure why you're doing it and what value it adds in terms of PR. You know, are increased sales down, like I say, down to the PR strategy, or are they in relation to something else completely?
Thank you. Joan, I'd love to hear what tools you're using, but also perhaps to cover off another of the questions by Sophie, who asked, how do you feel about the brand-to-brand interactions on social media recently, and how do you tread the right line?
Right, so I'll feedback on that one first. I think I kind of answered it as did Zebby earlier, because the idea is actually, I think that's great when you've got your tone of voice sorted and you're confident, but equally you've got to be clear as a brand that you're not poking fun, you're not being mean, you're not being rude, you're not offending anyone. But if it's all in the right jest and the right tone of voice, consumers get really drawn along with that. And I think you get a lot of, you know, there's a lot of people, I think the very successful stuff that Aldi have done have really almost never got, a lot of them still have never gone into an Aldi, but they like the brand. But I think they are warming people up because it was the kind of, you know, the outsider coming into Tesco, etc. I also like stuff where, you know, there's a bit of banter and a bit of support. And I think that's the things we've seen post-COVID as well, which is, you know, Tesco saying, don't come to us to buy booze, go to your local pub. You know, those sorts of things make you feel really warm and you realise there is a bigger world out there. I think in terms of data, my God, there is almost too many tools out there for us to look at. And actually the use of data can help PRs in so many ways if you have this massive budget. You know, I think you can start to look at, you know, data that gives you insights into your audiences, data that gives you insight into your media contacts. You can look at data then that helps you build where are we now and where are we trying to go? So reputation management. So I'm looking at working with a company called Impact. They don't know that yet, but I really like their tool, and they look at across QSR and restaurants, you know, where do you scale against your competitors, but also like-minded brands in the UK or in broader field, and where do you track on sustainability? Where do you track on people's perceptions of your brand? That then helps you plan. What is it? Where do we want to get to? And what are the steps in between that help us get there? So that would be another way. The other way then is when you get out into market. So you kind of know what you're measuring, you know who you're talking to, and you know who your media are. You know, the other ones then are, you know, how do you make your stories discoverable? So there is data and analytics out there that helps unearth your stories and gets it to the right people. There are news wires that have data analytics that can take your story to different places and can make those work. As Gaby said, there's a lot of stuff behind, you know, how do you make sure your stories are engaged in? So, you know, you may put them out there, but it's where they go. And then the fact that people then are able to kind of download a link, etc. So there are so many things that can be done. I think the problem is PR is never well funded, and a lot of these things are costly tools. So I think it's really picking off what, again, success looks like, and then being very single-minded on those tools that are most going to get you there and are not big measurement decks and, you know, analysis that you're never going to have time to read and you're never going to activate. So just be really clear about what you want and then see what's going to be the most useful and cost effective.
Great, thank you. We've had a question at the other end of the scale to data, which is the PR stunts side. And someone's client loves PR stunts. They're not a big fan. Where do you see them working well, badly, and how do you make them most likely to make them succeed? Gaby, do you want to answer about PR stunts? I don't know whether it's your bag, PR stunts, but you might have an opinion on it.
Used to be, certainly. And, you know, myself and Joan, full disclosure, used to work together, myself as an agency side and Joan on Coca-Cola, and often with Coke, you know, stunts were considered part of a toolbox for generating, you know, positive awareness and exposure. So here's my guide to stunts. I think the first thing to say is they are really hard, because you have to really get an idea, a creative concept right, that's going to do the things that you expect it to do. Because often stunts are designed to get that mass broadcast or, you know, tabloid type media. So your stunt has to be incredible to be able to cut through. And there have been many cases where that has happened. I think gaming companies are really good at doing stunts, and that's just fact, so are food and drink companies. So the first thing is, I would say, is that, do you have a story that's strong enough to create a stunt from? Recognize that it's often expensive to put the stunt together because it has to be quite visual. And often you need to bring in a sort of bunch of initial influencers that are going to seed out that story before it becomes mainstream. All of that, you know, it does cost a lot of money. So my guidance for a kind of small to medium-sized business is that unless you really do have something amazing up your sleeve, I would probably leave the stunts to the larger brands and focus on other types of coverage that can deliver the kind of impact that you need, which is probably a blend of awareness and you know, sales and growth as well.
Can I just add to that? I think it's also just generally in terms of our conversation, please take the time to understand what else has been done as well. You know, you're not going to get any traction for a very similar idea that's been done, you know, in the last 12 months as well. So I think as part of your due diligence, you know, see what else has been done that's quite similar. Because obviously pickup there is not going to be great, and people will probably recognize it as you know, an idea that's already been executed as well, and possibly better. So in addition to looking internally, I think, you know, as part of your research and development of your strategy, see what already has been done externally as well.
Great, thank you. Gaby and Zaiba, we've been asked a bit about budgets for startup companies, and I know you both consult, so maybe you can provide a bit of insight into sort of likely budgets that PR businesses at startup stage should be looking at. I know it's how long's a piece of string. Do you want to, Gaby, have a stab at that?
I'll have a stab at that. It's a bit of a range, to be honest with you, because, you know, some people are handling their own PR. And as a founder, sometimes that happens for a year, you know, or more, where people are coming to them and they're getting interviews, and you almost don't need to put much budget into that. It's just a kind of organic part of how you're promoting your business. As I mean, Joan said, obviously, PR is often not given the biggest amount of budgets in businesses. But that's not to say that it has to be the case. I think that PR for startups is a really good and probably a really cost-effective tool if you look at other devices, you know, like paid media activations, for example. So in terms of, okay, how much could it cost? I'd literally say from 0 to, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5 a month, something like that. I mean, it's just literally for a startup, as I say, it's kind of wide open, and it really just depends. I would just recommend startups to start with probably try not to pay for that, because it's probably something you can naturally generate as you're going along. I know that's not a brilliant answer, but it's an impossible answer.
Yeah, no, it's a tough question, and I certainly, you know, on the work crowd, when we see projects coming in from some more startup scale-ups, and they do vary considerably, and it is, what are they looking to achieve? Is it early stage launch? What is the right mediums to go through? So the team regularly have discussions with clients on that, and it's asked a lot. Any technical advancements that are changing the PR industry? Obviously, we've talked a bit about measurement, but there anything else out there that you see that's having an impact on the PR industry from a technical point of view? We've been asked. I don't know whether anyone has seen that happening at all. Joan, what's your thoughts?
Well, I'm not a techie. I don't think there's anything. I think there are the tools that help us understand data better. So I think that is obviously improving, and there's a lot more companies able to do that for us. I think the main technical advances are in the way consumers consume media. So, you know, the Googles, you know, the Google Homes, and the, you know, kind of the fact that you can ask a device any question is a great platform for, I think, brands in order to, don't know, just be front of mind. I think the other technical advantages are in, again, certainly in my sector, are direct to home, you know, deliveries, and you know, those apps are getting better, and those consumer experiences are getting better. I think, you know, and you've got things like mobile delivery, and like, it's fascinating. I think all of those things are interesting. I think the advancement of electric, you know, cars and vehicles changes so many businesses, you know, certainly bringing them in under, you know, the sustainability deliverables as well. And I also think the idea, you know, around AI and AR, you know, those are transforming how brands communicate, and also transforming how we can bring brands to life and to more people in different ways. So there are so many of those, and I've taken quite a broad piece, but I think it's really exciting. And again, there's just so much opportunity. It's just figuring out which ones land best and where your consumers are. Sometimes we have to anticipate where they're going, but it's you know, some really exciting AI and AR. I think that will really transform comms over the few years.
Great. And actually, leading on there, we've had a question around social and digital platforms have really increased their uptake during the pandemic. and what's the future do you see in traditional media, primarily print? I don't know who would like to have a stab at that one.
I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, look, the future of print is it's precarious. We see newspapers going behind a paywall and coming away from a paywall. So I think, and the newspaper industry, absolutely is shrinking. There are lots of mainstream newspapers that are having to lose journalists as well. So absolutely that the landscape in traditional media, in broadcast and print, is absolutely changing. There's a very fundamental shift happening at the moment. But at the end of the day, right, newspapers still need content. They still need content. I was just having a look yesterday and over the weekend, in terms of stories that kind of may have come back off a PR strategy, and they're still absolutely there, So I think it's just being much more savvy, and I think to be honest, I think it really means developing those relationships with journalists as much as you can, not just when you have something to plug, but continuing that dialogue. It's also helpful to remind people that journalists move. They go from the Sun to the Mail, they may go to the Telegraph. So journalists move. So kind of owning that relationship, having a good dialogue, honest dialogue, with journalists. They don't appreciate half-baked press release coming through that they have to do all the work for. So think about good quotes, think about visuals for them, assist them as much as you can, and that relationship will develop. So I really think it's really built up on developing those relationships and just really understanding, what content they need as well. But please, absolutely, read and watch media. You can't pitch something to a journalist if you have absolutely no sense, what their remit is, what the tone of the newspaper is. Does it have a particular angle? So just take that time, because it really is a genuine investment, I think.
Great. I'm conscious of time. We're getting towards 1 o'clock. A couple of big questions coming in, though. There's so much brilliant content out there that's really well produced by big brands and independents. What's the one or two things PR professionals can do to help brands stand out of the crowd? Gaby, what's your thoughts?
That's a really good question. I think it starts with what is unique about your brand, your business, your story. And if you feel that it's too much like the competition, sometimes the role of, I think, a good brand marketeer / PR person is to help suggest features that could enhance that unique selling point. And there are all sorts of things that, creative people come up with, like aspects or features that you can add to a website to enhance a customer service, for example. So I think it fundamentally starts with what is that unique selling point around the business, that kind of traditional marketing convention, and then helping to craft that narrative around it. And I think standout is so important for not only PR, but also for driving authority online as well. So just ensuring that the brand is being really clear about why it is so relevant to its customers and what is so new and exciting about it. That's the place that I would start. Great.
Joan, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Abby says, as usual. But also, I do think, I think the other two things are the fact that it reaches people on a personal level. I think that is one way to really stand out. At Christmas, I know we're all overloaded with, sat there with our boxes of tissues every time we see a John Lewis ad or, Sainsbury's latest Christmas ad, but they do reach you on a human level. And even those ads, whether it's the Christmas one from Coke or whatever, they do try to engage with what is here and not always what's here. And I think that's really important. We need a bit of that sometimes. And I think the other one is just being able to read the cultural mindset, so where is society right now? So, there are certain things we probably are just so bored of seeing, no more clapping anymore. It's, there are certain things that you have to read that cultural and societal mindset in order to just be relevant and not to turn people off, but actually, you know, really talk to them both from a heart perspective, but also, you know, what's relevant in their lives and what they're going through, you know. And I think, you know, a lot of the brands, you know, looking at food poverty and looking at, you know, children's meals, school meals, and so on, you know, that really resonates, because whilst everyone is just kind of just bored sitting at home, there are people who would genuinely have issues and generally have big worries that you know, make you feel we could be doing things to help other people. So I think those kind of lenses are really important.
Great, thank you. We've had a question on what's the biggest challenge you faced in your role and how did you overcome it? So I'm sure there's been some major PR challenges that you've faced. So maybe this is a question for everyone. Zaiba, I'm going to start with you because you're next to go. So any big challenges?
Okay, so I often have to deal, again, as an external consultant, with teams, internal teams. And I would always, okay, there are two things I think that generally come up as challenges, really, is relating to having an external perspective. Okay, so you spent all this money on a strategy, but actually, did you consider getting an external perspective on it before? Because as Joan said, you can really, it's amazing how many people would sign off something which is completely inappropriate. You know, we all know those adverts, and you talked, Joan, about the woman in the kitchen one. There's a very similar one where there was a government campaign to get women into science, and they used a young girl dressed as a ballet dancer. I mean, it just can complete, and they had to pull the campaign, I think. So it's amazing how a lot of people can look at something and still get it quite wrong. So I think the challenge is being somebody from outside and giving a fairly honest but helpful, hopefully, opinion on what's working. And I think also just internal politics as well. You know, do you come together as a team? Do you understand what the objective is? Do you all sign off on that? You know, do you all have a culture that you all want to work towards? Do you all have the same vision? So I think often, again, there are teams that are fragmented, that have different ambitions, different objectives, and trying to kind of corral something that is a united vision, I think, is also a big challenge, quite frankly.
Thank you. Gaby?
Yeah, thanks for the time to think about that one. I would say it's not, I don't think I could necessarily share an exciting story about one big challenge. I think for me, the many micro challenges about our industry is often not having a very good brief, or having no brief actually at the beginning. So as an agency working for clients, or in actual fact even being in-house as I have been, it has to start with a really good brief. And that means, you know, being really clear about the objectives, about the audiences, all that really boring stuff, primary messages, secondary messages, what your PR toolbox is. And sometimes where that falls over is where a kind of disconnected, let's say, CEO might demand to have some kind of great coverage on the front cover of some magazine or other that they love, and that there's literally no strategy behind, or meaningful strategy in terms of how that could happen. So I think it just starts with perhaps having people that are thinking about a PR campaign on the client side, at least having an understanding of how it works, or an agency helping them and patiently helping them explain how the PR machine works. So that's probably, yeah, that's happened quite a few times.
Joan, what's your biggest challenge?
I'm answering this in the context of PR, not in the broader corporate social responsibility. On that one, that just needs board level input and support. But I think my always humorous challenge was always being in a big meeting with lots of agencies and hearing from an ad agency to say, oh, Joan, you can PR this. And I'm like going, no, I can't. So it's always that idea, which is, you know, coming from a creative strapline that there is a great PR idea behind it. And very rarely, in most cases, there isn't. And so it's always that assumption that we can turn in the magic and PR something that actually has no backstory, no context, and actually a journalist would walk a million miles away from it. So that would be my biggest challenge.
Great. Well, thank you. Zaiba, Gaby and Joan, it's been an absolute delight to hear all your thoughts and insights on what makes great PR. And thank you to the audience for all the questions that you put forward. The session has been recorded and will be available to review and share. And so, but please do sign up to our other future events. But thank you very much indeed for coming today to the panel and to the audience.
Thanks, Alice.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.